In the autumn of 1988, in a peaceful suburb in Oregon, a newly married couple vanished without a trace. Police scoured the rugged mountains and dense forests. They found nothing. No answers. No bodies. The case went cold within months. More than 3 decades passed. All hope quietly faded. Then, one small detail hidden inside a wedding photograph reopened everything and revealed a truth nobody was prepared for. To everyone in the quiet town of Oak Creek, Mark and Sarah Evans were the picture of an ordinary, happy couple. Mark was 26, steady, quiet, an accountant for a regional shipping company. The kind of man who double-checked his locks, kept his car spotless, and never forgot a birthday. Sarah was 24, a vibrant second-grade teacher, with a warm laugh and a habit of taking in stray animals. High school sweethearts, the two of them. The kind of couple that made people smile just watching them together. Mark grounded Sarah's boundless energy. Sarah brought light into Mark's careful, structured world. In early September of 1988, they married. A small community church at the edge of town, golden autumn trees, nearly 200 friends and family. A flawless day. In the photographs, Mark looks handsome in his dark suit, his arm around Sarah, who's glowing in white, smiling like nothing in the world could touch her. They couldn't afford a big honeymoon, so they spent a week driving the California coastline instead. When they came home, they settled into a small rented starter house with a white picket fence, and everything seemed perfectly ordinarily aligned for a long, happy life. Mark went back to his ledgers. Sarah went back to her classroom, pinning up autumn decorations for her students. Coffee on the porch in the mornings. Sunday dinners with their parents. Nothing remarkable at all. Then, exactly 4 weeks after the wedding, that peaceful life fractured permanently. Friday, October 14, 1988, Mark and Sarah had planned a weekend getaway to celebrate their 1-month anniversary, a small rustic cabin in the foothills of Mount Hood, about 2 hours from home. Hike, fish, sit by the fire, unplug completely. Mark told his younger brother David they'd be back Sunday, right after sunset. Friday afternoon, a neighbor saw Mark loading a cooler and a duffel bag into their green Ford station wagon. Sarah locked the front door, laughing at something he'd said, and slid into the passenger seat. They turned the corner and disappeared from view. No one in Oak Creek ever saw them again. Sunday evening came. A cold rain began to fall. Down the street, a neighbor noticed the driveway sat empty, and the porch light was dark. Monday morning brought real panic. At exactly 8 o'clock, Sarah's principal noticed she hadn't signed in, completely unlike her. She was always 30 minutes early. The phone rang and rang in an empty house. Across town, Mark's manager was equally confused. Mark never missed a day without calling ahead. By 10 that morning, Sarah's mother, Evelyn, got the call. A cold knot of dread settled in her stomach immediately. She knew her daughter. She knew her son-in-law. They would never simply abandon their lives. Evelyn let herself into the house with her spare key. Dead silence. Stale air. Friday's breakfast dishes still drying by the sink. Mail piled in the slot. Everything sitting in perfect, undisturbed order, as if time itself had stopped the moment they walked out the door. By that afternoon, police were involved. A deputy was sent to check the rental cabin near Mount Hood. The cabin's lockbox was still sealed. The cabin was untouched. Mark and Sarah had never checked in. The drive to Mount Hood was a straightforward route, well-paved highway, a few miles of mountain road. A search launched immediately along that route. Officers and family checked ravines, diners, gas stations. Nobody had seen the green station wagon. Then, Tuesday morning, as the fog was still burning off the peaks, a forestry worker driving an old logging road miles from the main highway, nowhere near the route to the cabin, spotted a car parked at an odd angle near a stand of towering pines. It was them. the green Ford station wagon. Within the hour, cruisers were tearing up the dirt road, sirens cutting through the silent woods. David Mark's brother arrived with one of the search teams, his heart slamming against his ribs. The car looked wrong out there. Wrong place entirely. A thin dusting of fallen pine needles suggested it had been sitting for a couple of days. But it was undamaged. No accident. Tires fine. Exterior untouched. It was what the detectives found inside that made the hair stand up on the back of their necks. The doors were locked. The keys sat gleaming on the driver's seat. On the passenger floorboard, Sarah's brown leather purse stood upright, wallet, ID, credit cards, nearly $200 in cash, all untouched. A thermos of coffee sat frozen solid in the cup holder. No struggle. No blood. No broken glass. It looked as though Mark and Sarah had parked, locked the doors from the inside, left the keys behind, and simply vanished into thin air. But what really haunted the investigators was what lay across the dashboard, a heavily creased topographical map of the mountain range, pressed flat against the windshield. Drawn on it in thick red ink was a frantic, jagged circle around a remote stretch of wilderness the locals called Whisper Basin. No trails. No views. Police people simply didn't go. And just outside the driver's door, pressed deep into the mud, was a single set of boot prints leading not away down the road, but straight into the tree line. Straight toward the basin. Something had pulled them into those woods. Or something had chased them. Lead Detective Thomas Harris, a veteran investigator, ordered everyone back immediately, worried about contaminating the scene. Yellow tape went up between the pines. The first mystery was the locks. It was an old Ford with manual push-down locks. Someone had pushed them down from the inside, then somehow gotten out and shut the door, leaving the keys sitting right there. If Mark and Sarah had simply walked into the woods, why lock their own keys inside? And where was the second set of footprints? Forensics arrived, dusting for prints in the freezing drizzle. Everything in the car was cataloged, nothing missing from Sarah's purse, cash, license, lipstick, checkbook, all accounted for. In the back seat, a duffel bag, sweaters, hiking gear, a cooler of untouched sandwiches and apples. They had never made it to the cabin. Their trip had ended right here, on this desolate road. By afternoon, K9 units arrived. The dogs picked up the scent from the duffel bag and followed the single line of boot prints away from the car, through thorn bushes and rotting deadfall, over uneven, treacherous ground. The prints were spaced far apart. Whoever made them had been moving fast. Running toward something. Or running from it. For nearly 2 miles the dogs tracked the scent until it reached the bank of a wide, fast-moving river swollen with mountain runoff. The prints stopped at the water's edge. The dogs paced, whining, and lost the trail completely. Whoever made those tracks had either waded into that freezing water or been swept away by it. The search that followed was the largest in the county's history. Helicopters with thermal cameras swept the treetops. Hundreds of volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through the brush, calling Mark and Sarah's names until their voices gave out. Whisper Basin gave up nothing. No torn clothing, no dropped belongings, no trace of a camp, as if the earth had simply opened and swallowed them. Back in Oak Creek, the toll on the families was unbearable. Evelyn stopped sleeping. She sat for hours in her daughter's empty living room, holding one of Sarah's coats to her face, breathing in the last trace of her perfume. She kept the porch light burning every single night, just in case. David's grief turned into obsession. He took leave from his job, drove up the mountain every dawn, hiked alone with a flashlight, a map, and a rifle, screaming his brother's name into the canyons until his throat bled. Police eventually asked him to stop. He was contaminating the scene, but stopping felt like admitting they were dead. Detective Harris turned to the couple's personal lives. 5 years of financial records, nothing but a small mortgage and modest savings. No secret debts, no gambling, no strange withdrawals. Mark's employer, his co-workers, his ledgers all clean, all boring, all exactly what they appeared to be. Sarah's friends, her fellow teachers, her old roommates, no stalker, no jealous ex. She dated no one but Mark since she was 17. The sheer normalcy of their lives was maddening. People vanish for money, for revenge, for jealousy, to escape something. Mark and Sarah had none of that. They were in love, financially stable, and completely, achingly ordinary. There was no reason for any of it. Winter buried the dirt road under snow. Search parties disbanded. The news stopped running their photos. The missing posters in the diner windows began to curl and yellow. Harris hated the phrase cold case. It felt like admitting failure. He kept the file on his desk long after new cases piled up around it, staring some nights at the crime scene photos, hoping a new angle might finally surface. He kept returning to the map. The jagged red circle. Forensics had found no usable prints on it. The cold and condensation had ruined any chance of that, and the ink was ordinary red felt tip, sold in every hardware store in the country. A dead end. Then, one February night, almost 4 months after the disappearance, Harris sat alone at his desk, exhausted, the map spread out under his reading lamp. He was tracing the circle in the air with his pen, trying to imagine the mind of whoever drew it. Panic? Warning? Meeting point? Frustrated, he reached to switch off the lamp and knocked it over. It fell across the desk, throwing harsh, low-angled light across the paper. And in that light, he saw something. Faint indentations near the circle, overlapping the printed contour lines, as if someone had pressed hard onto a different sheet of paper laid on top hard enough to scar the map underneath. Harris grabbed a magnifying glass. His breath caught. It was handwriting. The next morning he drove the map to the state crime lab, bypassed the waiting list, and demanded they run it through an electrostatic detection device, a machine built to lift indentations invisible to the naked eye. 3 hours later, a technician called him back into a darkened room. The map, dusted with fine black toner, sat under plastic on a light board. "I don't know what you've got here, detective," the technician said quietly, but whoever wrote this was terrified. Harris stepped up to the glowing board and read the words pressed into the paper. "We were wrong about the car following us. He is at the wedding. He is in the pictures." A cold chill went straight down his spine. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a couple who'd wandered off and gotten lost. They had been hunted, and in their final moments, they'd known it. Harris pieced together the sequence. They'd picked up their wedding photos Friday, right before leaving for the cabin. On the drive up, a car had been trailing them. At first, just an annoyance. But somewhere along that lonely highway, Sarah, flipping through the fresh prints, must have recognized something. A face. The same stranger from their wedding day, now behind them on the mountain road. They'd panicked. Turned off onto the logging road, hoping to lose him, and hit a dead end instead. Trapped, with the stalker closing in, Mark grabbed a pen and pressed a desperate warning into the map before they locked the doors, left the keys, and ran for their lives into Whisper Basin. By morning, the precinct was in chaos. Harris ordered every wedding photo tracked down, the professional album, the prints from Sarah's purse, all of it. A corkboard went up covering an entire wall. Detectives interviewed the whole guest list, stared at faces until their eyes blurred, looking for anyone out of place. Nothing. Smiling aunts, laughing cousins, happy coworkers. Every face in every photo was identified and cleared. No stranger, no stalker in the shadows. The lead collapsed completely. Had they imagined it? Misread the note? Picked up the wrong envelope at the lab? Without a suspect, there was no case to build. Time did what it always does. Months became years. The posters came down. The green station wagon rusted in the impound lot for 5 years before it was finally crushed for scrap. The 80s became the 90s, then a new millennium. Mount Hood kept its secrets buried under decades of snow. Harris grew old, retired in 2005, his hair entirely white, the weight of the case still in his chest. On his last day, he photocopied the map and the indented note, folded it into his wallet, and carried the failure home with him. Evelyn never recovered. She kept the porch light burning for 30 more years, refused to change the locks, refused to sell the house. David built a life anyway, married, moved away, raised 3 kids, ran a business. But every time it rained hard, he thought of his brother running through freezing mud. He was in his late 50s now. Somewhere inside, he was still the young man screaming into the canyons. More than 31 years passed. The disappearance of the newlyweds became a local ghost story, the kind people told around campfires and half believed. Then, in the late autumn of 2019, everything changed. Evelyn passed away peacefully in her sleep at 82. With no other children, the job of clearing out her house fell to David. Weeks of sorting through decades of memory. On a rainy Tuesday, he climbed into her dusty attic and, tucked beneath old winter blankets, found a heavy plastic bin. Written across the side in black marker, Sarah's Things Oak Creek PD Evidence Release, 1991. His hands shook as he cut the brittle tape. Inside, the wool sweaters from the duffel bag, the creased topographical map, Sarah's purse, and at the bottom, beneath a folded jacket, a yellow envelope from a 1-hour photo lab. He opened it. Glossy prints from the wedding, the same photos police had studied for months. Nothing new, no stranger. He nearly put them away. Then he noticed a small paper sleeve tucked in the back pocket of the envelope. Inside, the original strips of film negatives. He held one up to the light. 36 frames on the strip, only 24 prints in his hand. And that's when it hit him. In the 1980s, film labs didn't print every frame automatically. Anything too dark, too blurry, got skipped to save paper and chemicals. The rejected shots stayed hidden in the negatives, and nobody in 1988 had any reason to look. If Sarah had held those dark, unprinted frames up to the car window on the drive, squinting at a shape in the background no one else had ever seen, David didn't sleep that night. The next morning, he drove 2 hours into Portland to a lab that specialized in restoring vintage film and asked them to scan every frame at the highest possible resolution, especially the dark ones. The technician warned him the emulsion, after 30 years in a freezing, baking attic, might not survive. A week of agony followed. Then, at 8 o'clock one evening, an email arrived, a secure gallery link. David sat alone at his kitchen table, rain tapping the window just like it had that October night in 1988, and opened the folder. The early images were the familiar wedding shots, gorgeously restored Mark's suit, the autumn leaves, all of it sharper than he'd ever seen. Then he reached frame 25, and everything changed. This was territory no living eyes had studied in 31 years. Frame 25, a dark, grainy shot of the church parking lot at night, the shadows barely lifted by enhancement software. Frame 26, another shot of the same lot. Frame 27, David froze. Mark, loading wedding gifts into the back of the station wagon, unaware of the camera. And across the dark street, beneath the branches of an oak tree, a heavy pickup truck, and beside it, leaning against the door, the tall, broad shape of a man. Rugged outdoor clothing, staring straight across the street, straight at Mark. Frame 28, the last on the roll. The flash had caught him just enough. David zoomed in again. The face filled the screen. He knew this man. He shoved back from the table, hands over his mouth. The man wore a heavy canvas jacket, and on his feet, massive custom-laced hunting boots with deep, ridged soles. David slammed the laptop shut, grabbed his keys, and drove straight into the night toward the small rural house where Thomas Harris, long retired now, still lived. He pounded on Harris's door until the porch light snapped on. The old detective, wrapped in a flannel robe, squinted through the rain at him. David, what in God's name? David pushed past him, set the laptop on the coffee table, and opened frame 28, zoomed all the way in. Harris put on his reading glasses. leaned in. For 10 unbearable seconds, the only sound in the room was rain on the roof. Then the color drained entirely from his face. "David," he whispered, "tell me this isn't real." "It's real." It was in the negatives. Nobody ever developed them. He was watching them load the car. Harris stared at the boots, at the jacket, at the face. It was the face of the man who'd been first to arrive at the command tent 31 years earlier. The man who'd led search grids beside the police for weeks. "My God," Harris breathed, stepping back like the screen had caught fire. "He wasn't following them, David. He was hunting them. And we let him lead the search." "Who is he?" David demanded. Harris touched the edge of the screen, tracing the grainy face. "Elias Thorne. Local logging contractor. Knew every inch of that mountain. When the search overwhelmed the county, we called for civilian volunteers who knew the terrain. He was the first to show up, brought his own maps, floodlights, had this quiet, commanding way about him. We deputized him, gave him a radio, gave him control of the search grids. The horror of it settled over the room like a physical weight. There was a morning the dogs picked up a strong scent heading east, into the ravines," Harris said, his voice hollow. "Thorne stopped the line, said the tracks had washed out, told us it was just a deer trail. He talked us into moving the whole search 5 miles west. He had steered them away. For 31 years, he had stood shoulder to shoulder with the people looking for the couple he'd murdered, and no one had ever suspected a thing." David's vision went red. "Where does he live?" "I'm going right now." "Stop." Harris grabbed his shoulder, old instincts flaring back to life. "You go there with a rifle. You go to prison. And he walks on self-defense. We have one photograph after 31 years. If we botch this, a judge throws it out and he dies a free man. We do this by the book." At 2 a.m, Harris called Captain Robert Miller, head of the Oak Creek precinct now, but a 22-year-old rookie back in 1988, standing guard over the abandoned station wagon in the rain. Within the hour, Miller was in Harris's living room, staring at the photo, his face draining of color too. By dawn, the three of them were in the evidence room, pulling the sealed bins from 1988. Wrapped in foam inside a small box, the plaster cast of the single set of boot prints found beside the car. They laid it beside the digital photo of Thorne's boots and zoomed in. A perfect match. Custom leather welt, deep-ridged logging tread, reinforced heel identical to the tracks that led into Whisper Basin. They needed a motive. 12 hours combing financial records turned up the answer. A canceled check, dated August 12, 1988, written from Mark's account. $450. Payee, Thorne Timber and Contracting. Memo, front yard picket fence. Thorne hadn't spotted them randomly on the highway. Mark had hired him. For 2 weeks that August, Elias Thorne had worked in their front yard, watched Mark leave for work each morning, watched Sarah bring him glasses of ice water on the porch, listened through open windows as they talked about the wedding and the cabin trip. The stalking hadn't started on the mountain. It had started at their own front door. With the boot match, the photograph, and the motive, Miller took everything to a judge that afternoon and walked out with a high-risk search and arrest warrant. By evening, tactical teams were moving. Headlights off, they crept down a long dirt road to Thorne's 60 acres at the edge of the forest, a fortress of rusted chain link, no trespassing signs, and rotting logging equipment. Bolt cutters opened the gate in silence. Officers spread through the mud toward a decaying 2-story house, dark and still. The battering ram took the door in one hit. They found Thorne sitting alone in a rotting recliner, the blue glow of a muted TV the only light in the room. 74 years old. He didn't flinch, didn't reach for anything. As half a dozen laser sights settled on his chest, a slow, empty smile crossed his face. He raised his hands, wrists together, ready for the cuffs. He'd been waiting 31 years for this. The house yielded nothing. But cadaver dogs, working the property under stadium lights through freezing rain, eventually broke away toward the back edge of the land toward a mound overgrown, with blackberry vines and rotted canvas tarps barking and clawing at the earth. Beneath the vines, a pair of reinforced steel doors, sealed with 3 heavy padlocks. A hidden concrete bunker built into the hillside. Bolt cutters again. Miller pulled the door open against a groan of rusted hinges, and cold, stale air rushed out of the dark. Down a narrow concrete stairway, the bunker wasn't a dungeon. It was a shrine. On a clean wooden table against the far wall, Mark's silver watch, polished, Sarah's wedding ring resting on a scrap of velvet, a set of Ford keys on a faded leather chain, the very keys that had locked the station wagon 31 years earlier. And at the center of the table, a thick leather journal. Miller opened it under his flashlight. What he read on the first page told him exactly what had happened in Whisper Basin on the night of October 14, 1988. The journal began in August, the week Thorne built the fence. He'd written about Sarah, her smile, her kindness, the glass of ice water she brought him in the heat. A slow, festering delusion had taken root. Sarah was an angel trapped in an ordinary life, and Mark didn't deserve her. Thorne convinced himself he was meant to take her to keep her, to protect her from a world she was too good for. He began parking down their street at night, memorizing their schedules. On the wedding day, he couldn't stay away, parked across from the church, watching them load gifts into the car, never knowing Sarah's camera flash had just caught his face in the dark. The entry for October 14 described the ambush in chilling, methodical detail. Thorne had known about the cabin trip for weeks. He followed them onto the highway, staying a few car lengths back. In the passenger seat, Sarah, bored on the long drive, pulled out the dark, unprinted negatives and held them to the window light. And saw him. Panic. Mark accelerating, swerving, realizing they were miles from any phone or town. Grabbing the pen, pressing the warning into the map. But Mark drove a station wagon. Thorne drove logging trucks for a living. 10 miles short of the cabin, his truck slammed into their rear bumper, sending them spinning into a ditch. Thorne climbed down with a rifle. Mark, unarmed, bruised, terrified, threw himself between the gun and his wife and fought like his life depended on it. Because it did. Thorne struck him unconscious with the rifle stock, bound Sarah's hands, and loaded them both into the covered bed of his truck. He brought them here, to this bunker. He expected Sarah to eventually accept what he told himself was rescue. Instead, she fought him with everything she had screamed, until her voice broke, told him she'd rather die than look at him again. That same night, in the freezing dark of the bunker, Elias Thorne murdered them both. Miller had to stop reading for a moment. The room held its breath. But the real horror wasn't the murder. It was what came after. Before sunrise, Thorne dragged the wrecked station wagon out of the ditch with chains and drove it across the mountain, miles from where it had actually happened, to the remote logging road near Whisper Basin. He staged the scene by hand, Sarah's purse on the floor, the map on the dash, never realizing the indentations his own victim had scratched into the paper would one day betray him. He locked the doors from inside, left the keys on the seat, and walked in a straight, deliberate line into the tree line in his hunting boots, all the way to the river where he waded in and let the current carry his scent away for 2 miles before climbing out on bare rock, leaving nothing behind. A locked room mystery built entirely out of misdirection. And then, in an act of pure arrogance, he walked into the Oak Creek police station and volunteered to lead the search. Stood beside the detectives, poured coffee for Mark's grieving brother. Pointed his own finger at Whisper Basin, steering the dogs, the helicopters, the volunteers away from his own land, every single time. For 31 years, Mark's watch and Sarah's ring sat on that table as trophies. Proof, to him, that he'd outsmarted everyone. Miller closed the journal. "Bring the digging equipment," he said quietly. "They're here." They never made it to the mountain. The journal's final page held a crude map of the property. By 3 a.m., under stadium lights and freezing rain, the excavation began. At 4:15, a shovel struck canvas. They found Mark and Sarah together, side by side, exactly where Thorne had buried them 31 years before. Mark's arm was still wrapped around Sarah's shoulders. He had held her until the very end. When Miller finally returned to the precinct, mud-caked and hollowed out, David and Harris were still there, waiting, having not slept. "We found them," Miller said, his voice breaking. "We brought them home. 31 years of not knowing. 31 years of staring out windows, hoping, wondering if they'd simply run away." It all broke at once. David collapsed forward in his chair, sobbing for his brother, for Sarah, for his mother, who had died just a few years too soon to ever know the truth. Harris placed a trembling hand on David's back, tears sliding down his own weathered face. The guilt he'd carried into retirement, knowing he'd let a killer direct his own search teams, finally, quietly, began to lift. The arrest made national news. Thorne never spoke to detectives, never looked at the evidence laid in front of him. He sat in his cell with the same empty stare he'd worn the night they took him. The case against him didn't need a long trial. The boot cast matched. The photograph placed him at the wedding. The journal was a full written confession. The remains were forensic proof beyond doubt. 3 months later, in a silent, packed courtroom, a judge sentenced Elias Thorne to 2 consecutive life terms without parole. He showed no reaction. He was let out in chains and died alone in a cell 4 years later, forgotten by the world he'd spent 3 decades trying to outsmart. The story of Oak Creek didn't end in that courtroom, though. It ended on a bright spring afternoon, when the whole town finally gathered for Mark and Sarah. The church where they'd married was full former students grown into adults, old co-workers, neighbors who remembered the porch light that never went dark. Miller and Harris stood near the back doors in their dress uniforms, watching a town finally begin to heal. David stood at the podium. He didn't talk about the monster, or the rain, or the bunker. He talked about a quiet accountant who loved his wife fiercely enough to stand unarmed in front of a rifle. About a bright young teacher who refused to break, who fought a much bigger man until her final breath. About their laughter, their kindness, and the ordinary, beautiful life they'd built in 4 short weeks. Afterward, at the cemetery on the hill, 2 caskets were lowered into the ground beside Evelyn's grave. The family finally reunited. David stayed behind after everyone else left. He took the small yellow envelope from his pocket, slid out the strip of negatives, and held it up to the warm spring light. For 31 years, the truth had waited there, trapped in a few frames of chemical film, buried in a dusty attic, patient in a way only the truth can be. It proved that evil can hide behind a helpful smile, that a monster can stand right beside you, pouring coffee, pointing at a map, and no one will ever think to look twice. But it also proved something stronger, that the truth doesn't stay buried forever. A footprint. An indentation pressed into paper, a shadow caught by accident in the corner of a photograph nobody meant to take. They wait in the dark, patient, quiet, until someone is finally brave enough to look closely. David set the envelope gently on the stone marker, turned up his collar, and walked down the hill toward his car. Behind him, the wind moved through the grass, carrying the faint scent of pine. The posters were gone. The search was over. Mark and Sarah Evans were finally at peace.